Hey guys, welcome to the Liberal Hive Mind, a channel solely focused on exposing the abundant hypocrisy of the left. You know, it's always the same thing, right? Those who talk about their virtue the most always tend to be the least virtuous, doing the least amount of good for the world. We got these leftists, and especially these globalist types, telling us they're fighting genocide, fighting discrimination and racism, but their main focus, their target seems to be always where it's not actually happening. Meanwhile, where it's actually happening, like in South Africa for instance, they're totally silent because it doesn't fit the narrative. But you know who is doing something to fight systemic discrimination against a group of people? Yeah, you pretty much already got it. Donald Trump. Now, maybe a month ago, he announced that he'd be looking into the issue, launching a full investigation into what's been going on, and now a month later, Donald Trump takes action, and it's about damn time. You know, finally, some real social justice. Let's continue to have this conversation that the mainstream media so deeply wants to ignore. We got some stuff to get into, so let's roll the tape. Alright, so first I want to continue adding context to what's going on here. Dave Rubin actually recently released a piece that I think is going to really help put it all into perspective. Here's a part of his interview with Robert Hersov. Take a look.
140 race-based laws in South Africa, all anti-white. And 8 days ago, Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, signed into law, and just hear these three words, expropriation without compensation. And this is just the straw that broke the camel's back. There's been endless laws, anti-white, boiling us like a frog in a bowl. And all I can say is thank you, America, and thank you, Donald Trump, for taking notice, because we are on the edge of the socialist abyss.
So how do you guys get out of this? Obviously, there's a complex racial history there. How do you reverse some of this? I mean, that's an awful lot of laws, and
I don't think we can internally. We have to wait till the 2029 national election, and I don't think our economy will survive. It requires some external dynamic to change it. And I think Donald Trump and America taking notice and coming in swinging with a baseball bat may be that dynamic we need.
So when you saw over the last couple of years in America, wokeness infecting our systems, and suddenly we were focused on race and we were putting it into it was this very people who said we were systemically racist that were putting racism into the system in a systemic way, must have given you a little concern about the direction we're going, as much as that's now been rolled back.
Well, we've been infected in South Africa with the evil woke mind virus way more than in America. We've got it times 2. And there's no momentum in South Africa to reverse it. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Hersov's revelations about South Africa are shocking, absolutely disgusting, but unfortunately for those of us who have been paying attention, not exactly surprising. For decades, we've watched white South African farmers get slaughtered in some of the most brutal ways imaginable. And what has the government done? Nothing. And for all this talk from left-wing governments about taking in the world's refugees, you can't close the border because of all the refugees that are coming in, right? It's kind of confusing why they would ignore it, especially coming from the side that's always virtue signaling about stuff like this. You know, human rights, genocide, racism, systemic discrimination, that's supposed to be the left's whole shtick, right? But of course, no, those are just concepts that they use and abuse domestically to gain political power. The idea that they would admit that white people would be victims of systemic racism, well, it would kind of break down their entire narrative. And so instead, what do? They completely ignore it. And they're also complete hypocrites because they're always talking about land seizures in Gaza, for instance. When we hear about Palestinian land seizures, it's an absolute atrocity. It's the worst thing ever. But the same thing happening on a systemic level in South Africa. It's not just the murder of innocent farmers. They've moved to the next stage of straight up legalizing land theft. No compensation, no process, just outright confiscation based on race. Yeah, well, I guess it's progress, right? Because it's going the other way around. Leftists across the globe seemingly don't have a single issue with it, because the narrative is that white people cannot be victims. And let's really put it into perspective. If any Western country enacted 140 race-based laws targeting one group of people, the UN and every leftoid under the sun would be screaming about human rights violations. If America or a European country started passing laws saying minorities couldn't own businesses, couldn't have land, couldn't succeed in certain industries, the media would descend into full-blown hysterics. There would be sanctions, there would be mass outrage. But when it's happening in South Africa targeting white farmers, nothing, not a whisper, because the people who control the narrative, the globalist elite, the media, left-wing parties and their NGOs, Well, they've basically all collectively decided that these victims don't count. Maybe they view it as some sort of justified retribution for the alleged sins of their ancestors. And that's kind of the twisted part, is that in a way it seems like South Africa is kind of like a cautionary tale. This is what happens if you allow for a race-based, vengeful socialist revolution to transpire. This is what happens when a government is so consumed by racial grievances. This is what happens when you let radical leftist policies run unchecked. First, it starts off with quotas. Oh, we're just trying to help people who have been historically disadvantaged. Then it's forced redistribution, and then outright theft, murder, and destruction. But of course, here's where it gets really interesting. Finally, somebody is stepping in, and that somebody is Donald J. Trump. And this time, he's not just condemning the situation like he did in his first term. He's not just asking for an investigation. He's taking real action. Trump is now offering an accelerated path to citizenship for white South African farmers that are being violently targeted by the government that's supposed to be protecting them. Take a look at this post right over here. South Africa is being terrible to longtime farmers in the country. They are confiscating their land and farms, and much worse than that. A bad place to be right now, and we are stopping all federal funding. To go a step even further, any farmer with family from South Africa seeking to flee that country for reasons of safety will be invited into the United States of America with a rapid pathway to citizenship. This process will begin immediately. So once again, the guy who's supposedly the callous, heartless Republican who's anti-social justice, turns out he's the only one actually doing true social justice work. And think about how genius this is. This move actually accomplishes so much at once. First of all, it helps America become more self-sufficient by increasing food production, something that I'd say is desperately needed given the global instability and ongoing tariff and trade wars. That point is basically self-explanatory. From what I understand, South African farmers are some of the best in the world. Well, if their government doesn't want them, Trump's saying, okay, we'll take them. We could use more farming. We could use more food production. And then secondly, it now forces the left to finally have to acknowledge that whites are being persecuted in South Africa, something they've been gaslighting the public about for decades. Trump is putting the spotlight on the issue. These people that are coming in will be granted refugee status, not by Trump himself, but likely by the courts. And so I guess that serves the purpose of exposing the left and their general lack of a heart and compassion. And finally, this is an ultimatum for South Africa. Either they course correct, or their most productive citizens will leave. And likely the country will collapse even further into socialist ruin. I think they're overlooking something. Who's gonna grow the food if you persecute the farmers and then a good chunk of them flee to America? Is the socialist government gonna deliver in terms of food production? Yeah, I'd say there's historic precedent to suggest probably not gonna happen according to plan. What's likely to happen in South Africa is exactly what happened in Zimbabwe. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, under the leadership of Robert Mugabe, the Zimbabwe government launched a violent and chaotic land seizure program targeting, of course, white-owned farms. But there was one problem with that. These farms were the backbone of Zimbabwe's agricultural economy. And of course, the white families that were running these farms had generational experience. They knew how to tend to the land, they knew exactly what they were doing. But what happened was Mugabe handed over the land to political allies and inexperienced small-scale farmers, all under the guise of economic justice. And very quickly it descended into complete chaos, turning into cronyism, corruption, economic collapse, and famine. In other words, the collapse of food production. Zimbabwe, which was once known as the breadbasket of Africa, descended into famine. Inflation skyrocketed, unemployment surged, and by the mid-2000s, I'm sure you guys have heard this before, Zimbabwe had the worst hyperinflation crisis in history. It rendered their currency near worthless. And then guess what happened? They had to beg the white farmers to come back, and then foreign entities, mainly from China, came in and basically took the industry. In other words, left-wing socialist grievance policies, radical grievance policies that led to land seizures and socialist-style redistribution schemes destroyed a once prosperous nation, and the country still has yet not to recover from the damage. Well, South Africa seems to be going down the same path, and that path might now be accelerated as finally these persecuted people have an option for refuge. Finally, we have somebody courageous enough to open the door for them. When in the past, Western nations were too caught up in all the woke stuff, too scared of what the left would say, too scared of the outrage, to do what's right for these persecuted people. They didn't want the headlines of taking in white victims. Absolutely disgusting, but Trump proves once again that he's willing to do the right thing despite the culture or despite the popular narrative, and that I'd say is real courage and real social justice. Anyways, that's pretty much what I got for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and possibly subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.